When Kirk Douglas, one of the last surviving legends of Hollywood's golden age, was asked in a late interview what he truly thought of Clint Eastwood, he paused, longer than expected. Then, with the weight of nearly a century in show business behind his eyes, he gave an answer that stunned everyone. For decades, the world knew Eastwood as the stoic cowboy, the rogue cop, the face of American masculinity. And Douglas, the gladiator, the producer, the last true rebel of old Hollywood. Two titans, both survivors in an industry that devours its own. And yet, behind their hardened personas was a complex, private relationship, one forged in admiration but laced with unspoken tension. What did Kirk Douglas really see in Clint Eastwood that made him choose such careful words? What did he mean by darkest star? And why, after years of silence, did he finally choose to speak up? This is the untold story of two Hollywood giants, and the hidden truth Kirk Douglas carried with him to the very end. When Kirk Douglas first laid eyes on Clint Eastwood, he wasn't impressed. It was the early 1960s, and Douglas, already a household name with films like Spartacus and Paths of Glory, was known for his commanding presence both on-screen and off. Eastwood, by contrast, was still the guy from Rawhide, a television actor with a quiet demeanor and a face made for westerns, but little else. Or so it seemed. The two men first met at a studio luncheon, surrounded by producers and agents trading scripts like currency. Douglas, ever the firebrand, held court with booming laughter and cutting wit. Eastwood, as usual, stayed at the edge of the room, sipping quietly and speaking only when spoken to. But there was something in his eyes, a cold calculation, a quiet understanding, that caught Douglas off guard. According to close associates, Douglas initially dismissed Clint as too reserved to survive the backstabbing world of Hollywood power plays. "He's too quiet to be dangerous," Kirk reportedly told a friend. But in time that opinion would change. By the late 1960s, Eastwood had reinvented himself in Europe, becoming a cult sensation through Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy. When he returned to Hollywood, he was no longer just a TV cowboy, he was a box office powerhouse. And Douglas noticed. Not just the success, but the transformation. The once soft-spoken actor now carried an aura of command, but it wasn't loud. It was lethal in its restraint. Eastwood didn't need to shout. He didn't need to brag. His silence did all the talking. Their first real collaboration never happened, not for lack of opportunity, but because, as insiders would later say, there was only room for one alpha. Douglas, a notorious perfectionist and control freak on set, clashed with directors, rewrote lines, and even took over productions when necessary. Eastwood, on the other hand, thrived on control, but did it through quiet domination, directing himself, shooting fast, and keeping emotions buried 6 feet deep. In many ways, they were opposites. But Douglas saw something in Clint that he didn't see in most other actors, a man who didn't just play dark characters. He lived in their silence. Over the years, the two would cross paths many times, at parties, in interviews, and through mutual colleagues. And while their conversations were brief, Douglas would later admit that Eastwood always left him with more questions than answers. He recalled a party in 1983, just after the release of Sudden Impact, where Clint arrived alone, stayed for 10 minutes, and left without saying goodbye. "That's Clint," Douglas told a reporter later. "He never explained himself. He just moved like a ghost." In his memoirs, Douglas wrote only a handful of lines about Eastwood, but each one was sharp. He praised his discipline, his success as a director, and his ability to avoid scandal while living a public life. Yet he ended the paragraph with a peculiar sentence. If Clint ever wrote down what he's seen, the pages would burn before the ink dried. What exactly did Kirk Douglas know about Clint Eastwood that the public didn't? Was it just the reputation? Or had he seen something deeper, something more disturbing, in Hollywood's most elusive legend? By the time Clint Eastwood cemented himself as one of the most bankable stars in the world, Hollywood had already decided how it wanted to see him. The lone gunman, the tough-talking enforcer, the no-nonsense man who didn't blink when facing down death. But beneath the squint, beneath the deliberate coolness, was a man wrapped in more mystery than most of his contemporaries. Unlike Kirk Douglas, who wore his flaws openly, his ego, his affairs, his professional rivalries, Clint kept his demons locked behind his tightly drawn lips. And Kirk saw it. From a distance, Douglas watched a younger man gain quiet power in a system that chewed up even the strongest. But Eastwood never chewed back. He simply swallowed, smiled, and kept moving. And that frightened people far more than rage ever could. There were whispers, of course. There always are in Hollywood. Whispers that Clint's charm had sharp edges, that he could disappear emotionally, even from those closest to him. Whispers that behind his success was a trail of broken relationships and unspoken conflicts. While Douglas took pride in confrontation, Eastwood was the opposite. He didn't fight. He vanished. He let silence do the damage. In the words of one director, who worked with both men, Kirk would punch through the door to make his point. Clint would wait until the door creaked, and you realized he'd been on the other side the whole time. Douglas's fascination with Eastwood grew not from admiration alone, but from confusion. How could someone rise so far while showing so little of himself? How could a man known for playing emotionless characters avoid emotional accountability for decades? Even as Eastwood began directing and producing, eventually becoming an Oscar-winning filmmaker with Unforgiven and $1 Million Baby, he refused to play by the rules of stardom. No public apologies, no confessional interviews, no late-night talk show tears. He was polite, professional, even generous, but always remote. One producer said, he could look at you with kindness and still make you feel like you were standing on a cliff. Kirk Douglas, who had seen Hollywood's brightest lights and darkest shadows, began to realize that Clint's silence wasn't stoicism, it was survival. While Kirk had fought to stay relevant, often loudly and with pride, Clint had slipped under the radar, building an empire on stillness. But it wasn't the empire that haunted Douglas, it was the cost. Clint's life, by the time he was in his 70s, was a maze of estranged children, former lovers, and unfinished conversations. He kept his past behind a wall so high, even those who loved him didn't know what was true anymore. There was one story that particularly stuck with Douglas. It was from the set of High Plains Drifter, one of Eastwood's earliest directing efforts. The cast and crew praised him, but they also feared him. Not because he yelled, he didn't. Not because he threatened, he never did. But because he watched everything and said nothing. One actor recalled forgetting a line and nervously asking Eastwood for another take. Clint nodded, rolled camera, and let the scene play out. After the cut, Eastwood walked over, put a hand on the actor's shoulder, and whispered, "Don't ever let me see you doubt yourself again." The actor later said it was the kindest and most terrifying moment of his career. Kirk Douglas never forgot that story. Clint, he once told a journalist, could kill a man with kindness. And you'd thank him after. In his final interviews, Douglas made it clear he respected Eastwood. But admiration is not the same as understanding. He's a gentleman, Douglas repeated, but he carries ghosts. He walks with them, and some of them are still alive. As the years went on, Douglas's reflections became more pointed. He began to speak about the dangers of emotional silence, about the price of bottling pain. And while he never accused Eastwood of anything specific, he often used him as a symbol, the kind of man who bore the weight of old Hollywood's masculinity myth. Strong, silent, untouchable, and ultimately alone. Though they were never close friends in the traditional sense, Kirk Douglas and Clint Eastwood shared something that only a few in Hollywood's upper echelon could understand: survival. Both had lived through eras that chewed up men like them, that demanded stoic strength and punished vulnerability. Both had built legends out of resolve, but they had done so in opposite ways. Douglas was loud, opinionated, politically engaged, and passionate. Eastwood was quiet, enigmatic, and deliberately apolitical. And yet beneath their surface differences was a current of unspoken respect, but also perhaps a little fear. Because Kirk knew that silence isn't always peace. Sometimes it's where the worst parts of a man hide. There was one moment that defined their strange, shadowed bond, a moment that Douglas would later call his greatest Hollywood regret. In 1992, Douglas was offered a supporting role in Unforgiven, Clint Eastwood's grim Western masterpiece. It was a comeback film, a deconstruction of the very myth Eastwood had helped build. Douglas, reading the script, was moved. He saw in it the kind of story he'd always wanted to tell, a story about the cost of violence, the lie of heroism, the loneliness of old age. And yet, he turned it down. The official reason was scheduling. The real reason, some insiders claim, was pride. Douglas had long been a leading man. The idea of playing second to Eastwood, especially in a film so haunted by silence and pain, felt like surrender. In hindsight, he would say, "It was Clint's story. I should have been part of it. But I was too stubborn to step out of my own shadow." If you've made it this far, it means you're as captivated by Hollywood's hidden truths as we are. Take a second to like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us which Eastwood film still haunts you today. These legends shaped cinema, but their real lives were often stranger than fiction. Back to the story. After Unforgiven, Eastwood's reputation skyrocketed, both as an actor and as a director. Douglas, nearing the twilight of his career, began to reflect more publicly on legacy. He would often speak about regret, not the roles he missed, but the conversations he never had. "There are things I wish I'd said to Clint," he once told a biographer, "but I never knew how. He's the kind of man who listens with his eyes. If you talk too much, you lose him." It was clear that Kirk respected Clint not just for his craft, but for his discipline. Yet that same discipline created a distance that was impossible to bridge. In a town full of noise, Clint Eastwood had mastered silence. And to a man like Douglas, that kind of control was both admirable and terrifying. One of the most telling insights came during a 2006 panel when Douglas was asked which actor of his generation he admired most. Without hesitation, he said, "Clint." The room was surprised. He hadn't starred with Eastwood, hadn't worked under his direction, hadn't even been spotted with him much in public. But Douglas clarified, "He made the kind of career I wish I had the patience for." He didn't chase the spotlight. He built his own shadow, and then he disappeared into it. This line echoed for years among film historians. He built his own shadow. It summed up the unspoken rivalry and respect between the two men. Douglas was the storm, Eastwood was the silence after. But what Kirk began to realize in his later years is that the silence often carries more weight. Because in silence, there is room for mystery. And mystery, more than talent or fame, is what gives legends their eternal life. But Kirk also wondered, what did Clint lose in exchange for that mystery? What connections? What intimacy? What understanding? "You can be respected and still be alone," he said once. "You can be a legend and still not be known." As Kirk Douglas approached his final years, his interviews became fewer, but more reflective. The once fiery star of Spartacus and Ace in the Hole was now more poet than gladiator, using his voice sparingly, often with long silences between thoughts. When Clint Eastwood's name would come up, Douglas wouldn't flinch. He would nod slowly, letting the air settle before responding. "Clint?" he once said during a small roundtable event in 2019. "He's not the man you think he is. He's deeper and darker, but not in the way people expect. It was the closest." Douglas ever came to speaking plainly about his complex feelings toward the man he spent a lifetime observing from across the room. It wasn't scandal Douglas hinted at. It wasn't rage or crime or the usual sins that plagued Hollywood giants. No, what Kirk saw in Clint Eastwood was something far more elusive. A man who had spent decades refusing to be fully seen. And perhaps, Kirk felt, that refusal had come at a price. In contrast, Douglas had lived loudly. He had fought openly, stumbled publicly, made enemies, and then made peace. Eastwood, on the other hand, had kept his inner life on lockdown. His romantic entanglements were barely acknowledged, his emotional pain rarely discussed. Even as a filmmaker, he preferred characters who did the talking for him. The gunslinger, the rogue cop, the aging boxer, always men in pain, never explaining, never asking for forgiveness. In Douglas's final memoir, Life Could Be Verse, he included a poem simply titled The Other Man. It never named Eastwood, but those close to Douglas knew exactly who it was about. The poem spoke of a man of silence, a ghost who walked in daylight, and a friend I never called friend, but always watched from afar. The last stanza read, "He never spoke what hurt him most. He let it rest inside, and in that stillness, built a world where shadows learned to hide." Douglas's final commentary on Clint Eastwood wasn't condemnation. It was sorrow. A kind of gentle mourning for a man still alive, but trapped, in Kirk's eyes, by the very legend he had built. Clint became the cowboy he played, he once told a friend, always riding off before anyone could ask him to stay. There was admiration in his voice, but also a hint of heartbreak. Because Kirk knew the price of stardom, he'd paid it in broken marriages, strained children, and the gnawing question of whether fame was ever truly worth it. With Clint, he feared that price had been paid silently and completely. Yet Douglas never attacked him. Never once spoke with bitterness. In fact, in one of his last public comments before his passing in 2020, Kirk was asked during a retrospective who he believed would be remembered 100 years from now. He smiled and said, "Clint Eastwood, because people remember what they don't understand." And Clint never let us understand him. And perhaps that's the most haunting truth of all, that the quietest men aren't hiding because they're empty, but because they're full of memories, of pain, of choices they never voiced. Clint Eastwood, to the world, is a man of steel, but to Kirk Douglas, he was something more mysterious, more profound, and more tragic. A gentleman, yes, always respectful, always controlled, but beneath that gentleman's surface, Kirk believed, was a soul carrying more than any man should have to, and refusing, even now, to set it down.